Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt, one of my favorite guests for the past 5 years, Dr. Ben Carson, neurosurgeon extraordinaire, and now Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Good morning, Secretary Carson. Always good to talk to you.
Good morning. Good to be with you again.
Can I ask you at the start, does Bernie Sanders' momentum remind you at all of President Trump's momentum in 2016?
Well, I mean, it is quite a phenomenon. There's no question about it. And, what's interesting is that there are so many people who actually think that, a different approach where the government is empowered and the people just put their faith in the government is a good system.
I was, as you recall, front and center at a few of those debates, and I see a replay happening in 2020 on the Democratic side of what happened in 2016, which is everybody wanted to stop the eventual nominee, but the eventual nominee was a force majeure in that year, and I think that Bernie Sanders is the force majeure in the Democratic primary. Do you agree?
Well, I think there's a strong chance that that's the case. You must recognize that there are probably some forces that don't want him to be the candidate and may use a host of things available to them to keep that from happening.
Clearly, conventional wisdom in the Beltway doesn't want him, but that was what we saw with Trump, right?
No question about it. No question about it.
All right, now I want to play for you what Senator Sanders said about the housing crisis. You are the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Bernie Sanders, the likely nominee, was talking about it last night. Cut number 23.
What you are saying is that in communities all over this country, often as a result of a housing shortage or gentrification, where real estate developers say, why do I want to build affordable housing when I could build housing for wealthy people? Rents are soaring. We got 18 million families in America spending half of their incomes for housing. That is totally crazy. So to answer your question, we're going to do a couple of things. Number one, we have a plan to build 10 million units of affordable and low-income housing, which should open up the market and lower rents. Second of all, I grew up in a family that did not have a lot of money. I spent my entire childhood in a rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, New York. And that meant that my family, at least, we didn't have a lot of money, but we didn't have to worry about rents, going up by 10, 15%, which many Americans do. We believe that rent control is an appropriate tool nationally to tell landlords that they cannot simply jack up their rents to any rate that they want.
So, Secretary Carson, why don't you have a plan to build 10 million units, and why aren't you in favor of rent control nationally?
Well, we have a plan to remove a lot of the barriers to allow the system to build those units. That's the difference. With the system that we have in place now, we remove the barriers right now so that people can, in fact, engage in those buildings. Before we had the number of barriers that we have now, building of affordable units was not a particular problem. But now you're looking at a situation where you have zoning restrictions, height restrictions, noise restrictions, parking restrictions, wetlands, historical preservation. It goes on and on. The list is as long as your arm. And it takes something that was affordable and makes it completely unaffordable. If you can deal with those, that works. There are two forms of thinking. There are those who say, just give us more money, give us more vouchers, and we can just chase those prices as they go up. But the other way of thinking is, let's look at what's causing the ridiculous rise in prices, and let's fix that. And then if after you fix that you need more money, that's the time to talk about that. But to talk about it in the other order makes absolutely no sense.
Secretary Carson, I would love to see you and Administrator Wheeler appear together, because I think the greatest thing to happen to help the housing shortage in the last 3 years is when Administrator Wheeler removed the 404 rules, the Section 404 wetland rules, so that developers no longer have to give away crazy parts of their property to avoid hitting dry creeks, which are not, in fact, waters of the United States. It was a huge win for housing, though people may not have known it.
No question about that. And also, you look at the number of regulations that exist between the various agencies. By adopting a rule where one environmental assessment is adequate and you don't have to do 4 of them that duplicate each other, that speeds up the process enormously.
So the answer to a housing shortage is housing supply. We agree about that, but let's talk about, in the meantime, Bernie Sanders wants federal rent control. And I think this will be a big issue in the fall if he's the nominee because it has such great appeal. If you remember the famous candidate, the rent's too damn high. What do you think about rent control and how one persuades the average voter it's a terrible idea?
Well, all you have to do is look at places where it has occurred. What that has a tendency to do is actually depress the number of units that are available. It depresses the enthusiasm of those who build and manage those kinds of environments. So, again, it comes down to a matter of, do you want to allow the free enterprise system to work with the pressures that tend to keep the rents under control, or do you want the government to impose control of everything?
Now, I believe that correlation is not causation, but I also think correlations are interesting. Santa Monica, California has an extraordinarily stringent rent control regime. It also has one of the greatest homelessness problems in the United States. You have been talking a lot about homelessness. Do you believe rent control contributes to homelessness?
I think it does. And again, we need to diagnose the problem correctly. And the problem is not caused by landowners and apartment owners trying to gouge everybody. Are there some who do that? Absolutely. But that's not the vast majority of them. The real problem, obviously, is caused by the fact that people can't afford the things because the costs are driven by excessive regulatory barriers. And once we're willing to deal with that, we will solve this problem. This problem doesn't exist in all parts of the country, by the way. And that's one of the things that I've emphasized to the leadership in California. Let's actually look at the data. Let's look at the evidence that exists in other places. What's being done there that isn't being done here that is causing this problem? And they've actually agreed at all levels to do that. So I think we're really making some major progress.
How do you respond to the obvious objection that California has more homeless because it's warmer? Now, I respond by saying you should see D.C., which is definitely not a warm place, but they have a huge homelessness problem and have since I was a young man working there in the 80s. What is the source? Why are so many people homeless, Dr. Ben Carson?
Well, Florida has even better weather than California, and they don't have nearly the homeless problem that California has. So to say that it's weather kind of loses a lot of the flavor right there. Again, you go back, and I keep coming back to it because this is the answer. You go back to the root cause of the problem. And you have policies in a place like California that actually encourage people to come there, encourage people to live on the streets. When you have a concept that compassion means allowing people to sit and squat on the sidewalks in front of people's houses, in front of people's businesses, that's an ill-conceived form of compassion. Compassion is recognizing that public spaces are for the public. They're for everybody. And real compassion is taking those people and putting them in a place where they can get a bed and a shower and clean laboratory facilities, and more importantly, some of the wraparound services. If they're drug addicted, if they have mental problems, if they have lack of financial knowledge, deal with those issues so you can get these people out of the situation rather than just accumulating more and more of them every year.
What about the high-end homeless? And by that I mean people who are a first and last month's rent away from reestablishing themselves as a non-homeless person. They're working, they're willing to work, they are not mentally disabled, they are not addicted, they've just had hard times. And so they're a first and last month away. They're the high homeless. How do you help them?
Well, a lot of those people just need some direction. We're in an economy now where there are more jobs available than there are people looking for them. But if you don't know where to go to get that job, if you don't know where to go to get that training, if you have children and you don't know how to get child care so that you can avail yourself of the things that are available, then it may as well not be there.
Okay, last question, Doctor. I want to take advantage of your medical knowledge. How worried are you about coronavirus?
Well, first of all, I have to say, our government and the CDC has been doing an enormous job to keep this thing under control the way they have. A lot of kudos there. Doesn't mean that we should let our guard down, because particularly if we get, an infection in an uncontrolled environment, let's say a homeless camp, it's going to spread like crazy, and it's going to go everywhere. So, we have to be cognizant of that. I'm being assured that we have public health experts who are working on that very issue in case it does occur, but they've done a tremendous job. It's a low risk for the average American right now, particularly, if you're healthy. But we should not let our guard down. Do
you think pandemic is likely, because you just mentioned what I think is the nightmare scenario, if the virus escapes from mainland China into a vast slum, whether it is in Africa or in South America or anywhere in Asia, it will spread like wildfire?
There's no question that potential exists. And am I concerned about it? Absolutely.
As a doctor, have you ever seen anything like this before?
Well, back in 1968, the Hong Kong flu was very similar to this, and it killed a lot of people. It became a pandemic.
That is what John Barry wrote about in his book, The Great Influenza, as the successor to the 1918 influenza. I'd forgotten it completely because I was a kid, but thank you for that reminder. Dr. Ben Carson, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you, Doctor.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Time to remind you, Relief